Adrian, what sort of reaction have we seen from China?
Well, a short time ago, we did hear from the Foreign Ministry in Beijing on Wednesday morning. Not surprisingly, they have spoken out very strongly against this bill, warning the United States not to interfere in China's internal affairs and calling on Congress to basically correct its mistake, in their words, and not to allow this bill to become law. As to what China does next, well, there are a number of options at its disposal. As you just heard in that report earlier, they can carry out all sorts of sanctions against US officials in China. They could restrict their travel in China. Now, when President Trump signed into law the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act last week, we saw just a few days later China barring US warships from docking here in Hong Kong. It also announced it would sanction a number of US NGOs here in Hong Kong. But it hasn't really specified what more it can do, but there is no doubt that what you're looking at here is what, in many ways, a Cold War looks like. And this is not the beginning, this is not the end. We are in the middle of a deepening Cold War between these two superpowers. Now, Xinjiang is an area of extreme importance to China because it lies at the heart of President Xi Jinping's ambitious One Belt, One Road project. But there's only 1.5 million people who live in Xinjiang, and half of them are these ethnic Muslim Turkic-speaking people, the Uighurs, some 9 million of them. But there are also an almost equal number of Han Chinese, and the two communities, as I saw when I visited Xinjiang last year, barely interact with each other. And when you are there, you really do detect this almost tangible fear among the local Uyghur population. Wherever you go in Xinjiang, you see surveillance cameras. This is the most tightly surveilled part of the country where surveillance is all very, very, very widespread. Now the United States is saying it's going to prevent United States companies exporting that sort of surveillance technology to Xinjiang.
OK, Adrian Brown there, live for us in Hong Kong. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get more reaction from China now. Einar Tangen is a political analyst and government advisor and joins us now from Beijing. Einar, we've been hearing there that China has already come out with an angry response. Just why is China so angry at the US wanting to play its role as a moral leader?
I think the hypocrisy of saying that the U.S. is in a position to be a moral leader at this point, given what's going on in the Middle East and other places, it really strikes a chord within China. But most of all, this is they're seen as a continuing series of attacks, really aimed not so much at freeing anybody or human rights, but as putting pressure on China as it's these negotiations, these trade negotiations going forward. Now, having said that, I believe is the Trump administration's point of view. If you start looking beneath that at the Democratic side and the fact that this was bipartisan, it seems the only thing that people in the U.S. In politics in Washington can agree on is that China is somehow an evil empire. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. China is not really doing anything differently than it has done for many, many years. But because of its sheer size and the implications of it becoming the second world power and potentially the first world power, you're starting to see a lot of friction.
But isn't it possible, Einar Tangen, that this isn't about getting an upper hand with trade, that people are genuinely horrified by the allegations of what China is doing to the ethnic Uyghur population?
Well, I mean, there's two sides of the story. I mean, and then there's always going to be a divide on this, because on one side, in the West, we view the rights of the individual as almost being superior to the rights of society. We'll go to extreme lengths to make sure that they are obeyed, that there's a freedom of speech, all of these things. And that is endemic to how we see ourselves. But when you start talking about Asia, it's the reverse. Society is put first. all right, and the individual is secondary to it. So if you start going around in China and you go to, it doesn't matter if you're in Beijing or the smallest village, and you ask them about Xinjiang or Hong Kong or Tibet or Taiwan, you're going to get a much harsher, more hawkish view than the actual government takes. The government is actually taking a very, very moderate line compared to where a lot of its netizens are saying they should be. They don't understand why.
How is society best served by locking up more than a million of its citizens? How is society best served by detaining a vast number of people? And the other allegation, this is tantamount to an ethnic, a cultural genocide.
Well, from their perspective, you're putting loaded words in there. There's nothing that's saying that they're preventing people from speaking the Uyghur language. What they're saying is that they must learn Han, they must learn trades, they must be able to speak and function in society. Otherwise, you'd have an apartheid.
But in the China cables which were released, and these documents have been dripped out by the New York Times, by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, documents were released that say memos were given by the Chinese government to never allow escapes, to never allow people to escape from these camps. That doesn't imply that it's a voluntary process and everyone's just going in to learn Han Chinese. And certainly from others, from Uyghurs who have been leaving China, who have been testifying, they've been saying something very contrary to that their family members are locked up and they are not allowed to, they're not allowed to contact them.
Well, from China's perspective, what they're doing is following what they perceive to be the UN action plan against extremism. And that means addressing the issues of poverty, unemployment, making sure that there's education available. China does not want an apartheid situation to occur because they simply, and there's some people who blame them for saying, why did you let this occur in the first place? Why did you let people not send their children to school, only to go to the madrasa on Saturdays where they could learn the Quran? They didn't learn about science. They're not able to speak Han, Putonghua, the standard language of China. So therefore, they're limited. They can stay on the farm. They can
the solution is surely not to be forcing people, separating families. But nothing else. And these are all certain points that China's can put forward. But the other allegations coming out of these cables detail charges which are much more serious. And this is the reason why these politicians in the US have decided to pass this bill.
Well, I don't know that that's completely the reason. I mean, you have to understand that there are perhaps different cultural views, that the world is not monochromatic. China views this as necessary steps to prevent violence. Remember, this is a one-party system. Anything bad that happens is the fault of the government. And in this particular case, they've had no attacks in 3 years. So from the general population's point of view, they say, no, that's fine. This is what they should be doing. They must retrain these people, even if it's forced. They don't care about that. And the government is pursuing that line. They say that it is better to act now than to have a festering situation where people who are limited by their education and poverty are easy targets for extremism. Now, let's take it on the other hand. If China did nothing, and they allowed this kind of apartheid situation to occur where these people didn't have skills and they were basically forced things. Now, remember, there were more Uyghurs were allowed to have more children than the one-child policy, up to 7. And in a lot of rural areas, this represented free labor. But the difficulty is when it comes to dividing up the land, there's not enough land to divide in 7 pieces and then 7 more pieces. So at this point, they need to do this. I mean, the Chinese government is rolling out a series of statistics, 460,000 jobs created in the last 10 months. Trade up 28%, violence down. They point to the fact that since in the last 64 years, the economy has gone up 200 times. So from the Chinese perspective, it's all about bringing prosperity. What we value as human rights, they say is secondary. The primary human right is to live and eat.
Well, we could debate this on and on, but for now, Einar Tangen, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Beijing.